This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Andrew Peach. Britain's longest reigning monarch, Queen Elizabeth, has died at the age of 96. She died peacefully on Thursday afternoon at her Scottish estate, where she'd spent much of the summer. The Queen came to the throne in 1952 and witnessed enormous social change.
This is BBC News from London. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
Later in Global News, we'll hear about her commitment to the Commonwealth.
I want to show that the Crown is not merely an abstract symbol of our unity, but a personal and living bond between you and me.
And we'll hear tributes from across the world. After 70 years on the throne, this was the moment the world learned of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth's death.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. The palace has just issued this statement. It says the Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. The King and the Queen Consort will remain at Balmoral this evening and will return to London tomorrow.
The Queen's family gathered at her Scottish estate after concerns grew about her health earlier on Thursday. Her eldest son Charles, the former Prince of Wales, is now King Charles III. He released a statement following his mother's death, which we can hear from our royal correspondent, Johnny Diamond.
The death of my beloved mother, Her Majesty the Queen, is a moment of the greatest sadness for me and all members of my family. We mourn profoundly the passing of a cherished sovereign and a much-loved mother. I know her loss will be deeply felt throughout the country, the realms and the Commonwealth, and by countless people around the world. During this period of mourning and change, my family and I will be comforted and sustained by our knowledge of the respect and deep affection in which the Queen was so widely held.
Razia Iqbal spoke to our UK correspondent Rob Watson to reflect on how the day of her death unfolded. It began in Parliament.
It was around 12:30, and interestingly, in Parliament, life was sort of going back to normal after the replacement of one Prime Minister by another, and of course, all of that done by the Queen, by the Queen's appointment. There was a proper row developing about energy policy, what was the best way to try and deal with soaring energy prices, and then suddenly you could see the expressions change. And then the Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, read out a statement saying that everybody wished the Queen well, were sad to hear that she was in health. And then you could see the politicians, the expressions on their faces change. And then, of course, very soon you had the news that there were members of her immediate family, her 4 children, her grandchildren were on their way there. And you could just tell from the politicians, you could tell from the mood in the palace that there was something afoot.
And the unusual nature of the palace making the announcement that doctors were concerned for her health.
Yes, because in her 96 years, she has been blessed with extraordinary health, and by and large, the palace has hardly needed to comment very much on her health, but they rarely did. So when you heard that there was concern for her condition and that she was comfortable but that her family were on the way, and you could just sort of sense that this was something where the palace had not issued a statement out of the blue. This was not something in the normal run of things.
A statement was then released that Queen Elizabeth had died peacefully in her sleep with her children in attendance. Our Scotland editor James Cook is at Balmoral Castle where she died.
The sun, shrouded in cloud, set here on the Balmoral estate, setting too on the end of an era for the United Kingdom and for the world. And minutes after it did so, a car swept through the gate, several cars in fact, one of them we believe containing Prince Harry to join his brother, Prince William, and his father, the King, in mourning for Queen Elizabeth, a monarch who has a special place in the heart of this nation, but who in return had, in her own words, a deep and abiding affection for Scotland. A moment, of course, here, behind these gates, for a family, first and foremost to mourn, but a moment too for a nation to reflect on an extraordinary reign and on the end, the severing of links with the Second World War, the existential threat to this country which this nation survived, and also to the British Empire, which in many ways the Queen embodied for some of her reign. She also, I think it is fair to say, embodied the union of the crowns between Scotland and England, that union dating all the way back to 1603.
James Cook at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. Queen Elizabeth carried out her duties with honour and dignity. She was rewarded with respect and admiration. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell looks back at the Queen's life.
She wasn't born to be Queen, yet she became Britain's longest-lived and longest-reigning monarch. Across the decades, as society changed fundamentally, Elizabeth II was a constant and, for many, a reassuring symbol of national unity. It was a life, above all, which was guided by her sense of duty, something she'd first referred to in a broadcast at the age of 21.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
Born in April 1926, Princess Elizabeth's role as a royal was transformed 10 years later when her father came to the throne after her uncle had abdicated. The early years of George VI's reign were dominated by the Second World War, much of which Elizabeth spent within the comparative safety of Windsor Castle. At the start of the conflict, Elizabeth had fallen in love with Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, a prince of Greece, though he was largely Danish, and an officer in the Royal Navy. They married 8 years later.
And as the wedding march peals out gaily through the Abbey...
The early years of their married life were relaxed, but in February 1952, Elizabeth's father died while she was in Kenya. Her coronation the following year was watched by millions. The Queen enjoyed being a constitutional monarch. She had the right to be consulted, to advise and to warn. She never gave an interview, but in the early 1990s she spoke in a BBC documentary about her duties and the nature of her life.
If you live in this sort of life, which people don't very much, you live very much by tradition and by continuity. I find that's one of the sad things, that people don't take on jobs for life. They try different things all the time. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you'll know exactly what you're going to be doing 2 months hence, or even beginning to know about next year. And I think that this is what the younger members find difficult, is the regimented side of it.
By 1992, there'd been fairy tale royal weddings and painful separations. At the end of that year, there was a fire at Windsor Castle. The Queen admitted it had been a difficult 12 months.
1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
When Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed in a car crash in Paris in 1997, the monarchy was shaken. The Queen was accused of being out of touch. She made a live television broadcast on the eve of Diana's funeral.
I, for one, believe there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death. I share in your determination to cherish her memory.
5 years after Diana's death, in 2002, people turned out in their tens of thousands to mark the Queen's Golden Jubilee. One of the highlights was a pop concert inside Buckingham Palace. There were more significant milestones, a historic state visit to the Republic of Ireland, and an equally historic first handshake with the then Northern Ireland's Deputy First Minister, Martin McGuinness, once a former commander of the IRA. In June 2012, a national service of thanksgiving was held at St Paul's Cathedral to mark the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. A month later, at the opening ceremony of the London Olympics, she played herself in a spoof James Bond film. She was a mother, a grandmother and a great-grandmother who became Britain's longest-serving monarch in September 2015 when she surpassed the reign of Victoria. It wasn't something the Queen said that she'd ever aspired to.
Inevitably, a long life can pass by many milestones. My own is no exception. But I thank you all, and the many others at home and overseas, for your touching messages of great kindness.
She continued with her public duties well into her 90s, often alone after the retirement of the Duke of Edinburgh. There was further family turmoil. Prince Andrew was forced to withdraw from public life over his ill-judged friendship with a convicted American sex offender. And then the Sussexes, Harry and Meghan, decided that they wanted to step back from royal life. They were unsettling moments, presided over by a monarch who showed that her sense of commitment was undiminished. It was evident again during the coronavirus epidemic. The Queen, in isolation at Windsor for her own protection from the virus, broadcast a reassuring message to the nation.
We should take comfort that while we may have more still to endure, better days will return. We will be with our friends again. We will be with our families again. We will meet again.
Her personal resilience was tested in the spring of 2021 when her beloved husband Philip died 2 months short of his 100th birthday. At his funeral within Windsor Castle, curtailed by the social distancing requirements of the pandemic, the Queen seemed a solitary figure. But despite the great sadness of the loss of her husband of 73 years, there was never any question of her withdrawing. Public duties were resumed, public respect for a long-lived monarch deepened. She marked the 70th anniversary of her accession to the throne, a record no other monarch had achieved, in February 2022. By then it was apparent that she was rather more frail physically than before. Her doctors had advised her to take things a little easier. Light duties was the expression used by the palace. In a message to mark her 70 years on the throne, she said she was grateful for and humbled by the loyalty and affection she'd received throughout her reign. And she signed the statement, "Your servant, Elizabeth R." By June 2022 and the public celebration of her Platinum Jubilee, her declining health limited the events she could attend. There was, however, a delightful surprise, a somewhat chaotic tea party with Paddington Bear.
Perhaps you would like a marmalade sandwich. I always keep one for emergencies.
So do I.
This was a monarch at peace and enjoying herself. On the final day of the Jubilee celebrations, there was a final appearance on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. The national anthem was sung. A much-loved monarch acknowledged the many thousands who'd waited to greet her. The crowds cheered and cheered, but finally it was time to go. The Queen turned to depart from the balcony on which she'd first been seen as a baby. There was an unspoken feeling that an era was drawing to a close. For decade after decade, Elizabeth II embodied the strengths of a constitutional monarch, a steadfast presence in a constantly shifting world, representing a changing kingdom to itself and to the wider world. Hers was a life guided by Christian faith and by the unfaltering sense of duty to which she'd pledged herself on her 21st birthday. It was something she'd reflected on during her Silver Jubilee in 1977.
When I was 21, I pledged my life to the service of our people, and I asked for God's help to make good that vow. Although that vow was made in my salad days when I was green in judgment, I do not regret nor retract one word of it.
That report from our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell. Many tributes are being paid to Queen Elizabeth from around the world. The British Prime Minister Liz Truss, on her second full day in office, paid her respects from the steps of Downing Street.
Queen Elizabeth II was the rock on which modern Britain was built. Our country has grown and flourished under her reign. Britain is the great country it is today because of her. She ascended the throne just after the Second World War. She championed the development of the Commonwealth from a small group of 7 countries to a family of 56 nations, spanning every continent of the world. We are now a modern, thriving, dynamic nation. Through thick and thin, Queen Elizabeth II provided us with the stability and the strength that we needed. She was the very spirit of Great Britain, and that spirit will endure. She has been our longest ever reigning monarch. It's an extraordinary achievement to have presided with such dignity and grace for 70 years. Her life of service stretched beyond most of our living memories. In return, she was loved and admired by the people in the United Kingdom and all around the world. She has been a personal inspiration to me and to many Britons. Her devotion to duty is an example to us all. Earlier this week, at 96, she remained determined to carry out her duties as she appointed me as her 15th Prime Minister. Throughout her life, she's visited more than 100 countries, and she has touched the lives of millions around the world.
The opposition leader, Sir Keir Starmer, called her a remarkable sovereign, saying the nation shared in the royal family's grief.
Today we mourn the passing of a remarkable sovereign. It is a deep private loss for the royal family, and our first thoughts are with them at this time. The nation shares in their grief. Queen Elizabeth II created a special, personal relationship with us all. A relationship based on service.
The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, said the Queen's steadfast loyalty, service and humility had helped us make sense of who we are through decades of extraordinary change. The leader of the Catholic Church in England and Wales, Cardinal Vincent Nichols, called her a shining light in our history. And the former Prime Minister Sir Tony Blair said the UK had lost not just its monarch, but the matriarch of the nation, who more than any other brought the country together. There's more to come on this edition of Global News following the death of Queen Elizabeth after a reign of 70 years. Later we'll look at her deep love of horse racing.
I suppose I first became interested in racing during the war, when my father had leased Big Game and Sun Chariot from the National Stud. When my father took me down to Beckhampton to see them working, and I was able to pat them in the stable afterwards.
That length of service to the country, 70 years on the throne, includes living through the Second World War. The teenage years of the then Princess Elizabeth were dominated by conflict. She was, in fact, drawn into the war effort towards the end of the conflict and even served in a branch of the armed services. Clive Murray examines how the outbreak of hostilities affected the life of the future Queen.
The task will be hard. There may be dark days ahead, and war can no longer be confined to the battlefield.
King George VI, broadcasting to Britain and the Commonwealth in 1939. His daughter Princess Elizabeth was 13 when war broke out, her sister Margaret 9. Within months, the little princesses, as they were known, were sent to live at Windsor Castle. We went for a weekend, they said, and stayed for 5 years. Some thought the girls should be evacuated to Canada, but as Princess Margaret said later, the King thought differently.
I don't remember ever thinking we'd have to go. Some of our cousins went, and of course when they came back after the war, we couldn't understand each other because they couldn't think about what we'd been doing, being bombed and everything, and we couldn't understand why they hadn't been.
Windsor Castle was stripped of much of its luxury. Valuable furniture and paintings were stored away, and only a single light bulb was allowed in each room of the private apartments. But family life continued. The princesses were joined by their parents most nights, and Elizabeth and Margaret performed an annual Christmas pantomime. Cinderella was the first, with Elizabeth playing Prince Charming and Margaret in the title role. Princess Elizabeth broadcast for the first time in October 1940 on the BBC's Children's Hour, addressing those who'd been evacuated.
Thousands of you in this country have had to leave your homes and be separated from your fathers and mothers. My sister Margaret Rose and I feel so much for you, as we know from experience what it means to be away from those we love most of all.
The girls were close enough to London to see the fires from the Blitz. And, as Princess Margaret recalled, Windsor itself was often in danger.
Windsor being on the on the way back from bombing London. Of course, they dropped all their bombs on the park. So we were bombed practically every time. In the end, we had to go down and sleep in the shelter for a year and a half.
An air raid warden recalled one occasion when the future Queen and her parents visited the East End. More than 300 people had died in the previous night's bombing.
I remember her and Margaret, Princess Margaret, with their little straw bonnets, having a look round. But truthfully speaking, I have never seen royalty so terribly upset as they were when they saw this terrible devastation.
With the King at her side, she takes the salute as the regiment marches past.
In 1942, Princess Elizabeth was appointed Colonel-in-Chief of the Grenadier Guards. On her 16th birthday, she carried out her first public engagement when she inspected the regiment. 3 years later, she donned uniform herself, joining the Auxiliary Territorial Service.
When the training centre was visited by the King and Queen and Princess Margaret, they found Princess Elizabeth in overalls working on the engine of a Red Cross lorry.
230873, Second Subaltern Elizabeth Windsor, spent 3 weeks learning motor mechanics and how to drive. She was filmed dressed in dungarees, doing her bit for the war effort.
After watching other girls at work, the King returned and jokingly asked the Princess, "Haven't you got it mended yet?"
By the end of the war, she'd reached the rank of junior commander and a fully qualified driver. According to the royal biographer Philip Ziegler, she was keen to muck in with everyone else.
Of course it was a public relations exercise. I mean, her presence in the ATS probably, from the point of view of military order and good discipline, caused more confusion and trouble than it did good in the terms of the improvement of the state of the engines of the British Army. But equally, it had a very considerable moral effect, the feeling that she was behaving just like all other 18-year-olds, that she was joining in, doing her bit.
Outside Buckingham Palace, the crowds cheered themselves hoarse. 7 times during VE Day, the royal family appeared on the balcony.
When the war against Germany ended in May 1945, Princess Elizabeth and her sister slipped out of Buckingham Palace to join tens of thousands of people on the streets of London, many of them members of the armed forces, celebrating victory in Europe.
We cheered the King and Queen on the balcony and then walked miles through the streets. I remember lines of unknown people linking arms and walking down Whitehall, all of us just swept along on a tide of happiness and relief. I think it was one of the most memorable nights of my life.
Clive Myrie reporting. Queen Elizabeth attached huge importance to her role as head of the Commonwealth. A small group of former British colonies when she assumed the throne in 1952, the Commonwealth grew to represent 56 states, comprising a third of the world's population. As our diplomatic correspondent James Landale now reports, it was the Queen's family of nations and maintaining links with its members that kept her busy.
From the winter of faraway England, she flew in over the blue Caribbean.
1953, and the newsreels breathlessly welcome Her Majesty to Bermuda at the start of a 6-month tour of the Commonwealth.
For our young people, this was a time to be remembered always. This first visit of a reigning sovereign to our island.
In Fiji, the Queen was greeted by swirling spear dancers. In Uganda, it was tribal drums. In Sri Lanka, then known as Ceylon, one highlight was a magnificent parade of elephants. And in Australia, ecstatic crowds packed the streets, 3/4 of the population turning out to see her. More than 50 independent nations, nearly 2.5 billion people, the Commonwealth was an institution to which the Queen was devoted, as she made clear in her Christmas message from New Zealand.
I want to show that the crown is not merely an abstract symbol of our unity, but a personal and living bond between you and me.
A few months earlier, Elizabeth had been crowned, but unlike her father, there was no mention of empire in the coronation oath.
Will you solemnly promise and swear to govern the peoples of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Union of South Africa, Pakistan, and Ceylon.
The empire was dying, the Commonwealth taking its place, and it was to that association of equals she was committing herself.
I solemnly promise so to do.
And in that first Christmas broadcast, she committed herself to a vision for the future based on an organisation of equals.
The Commonwealth bears no resemblance to the empires of the past. It is an entirely new conception, built on the highest qualities of the spirit of man, friendship, loyalty, and the desire for freedom and peace. To that new conception of an equal partnership of nations and races, I shall give myself heart and soul every day of my life.
Countries that were still colonies began to peel away.
Flowers for a queen, once more. Flowers for the sovereign of this new African state.
In 1961, with much fanfare, she saw Sierra Leone become independent. A dozen more in Africa, including Nigeria and Kenya, followed. Many of these independent states preserved their links as members of the Commonwealth, but two did not.
After half a century, the Union of South Africa has withdrawn from the British family of nations. Racial discrimination remains her policy, and she will not apply for continued membership of the Commonwealth.
South Africa left, and in 1965 the colonial rulers of Rhodesia declared independence, equally determined to prevent a black majority. At a summit of Commonwealth leaders in Zambia in 1979, there was suspicion the British government wanted to recognise Rhodesia and lift sanctions. As John Humphreys reported at the time, it pitched the Queen into a Commonwealth crisis.
The Zambian president, Dr. Kaunda, told me quite bluntly that this is the rock on which not just the conference, but the very Commonwealth itself could founder.
Despite security advice, Her Majesty insisted on attending.
You've had a very busy day, haven't you?
Very busy, well? But I think very good so far.
She saw each leader privately in turn, helping to hold a fractious meeting together. Sir Sonny Ramphal, then Commonwealth Secretary-General, recalls the Queen manoeuvring the politicians into dealing with each other.
She made it clear to all prime ministers, all presidents, black and white, old and new, that the Commonwealth must not break. The Commonwealth must find a consensus. So that was a very powerful influence being exercised on the back of and on the strength of her considerable prestige.
The conference ended with an unequivocal declaration that apartheid was an affront to humanity. A year later, crowds cheered as Rhodesia became independent Zimbabwe. And eventually, apartheid in South Africa collapsed. In Cape Town Harbour, the Queen was welcomed by President Nelson Mandela and a new anthem for a new country. A deep wound had been healed, as Her Majesty told the South African Parliament.
The view may sometimes be a little obscure, but the events in South Africa of the last few years have helped to bring rays of sunshine to pierce the mist. May the sun shine ever brighter. Nkosi Sikelel' i-Afrika.
The Commonwealth still faces challenges. There are disagreements over issues like human rights and same-sex relations. In 2018, the Queen was granted her wish that the new king would lead it in her stead.
It is my sincere wish that the Commonwealth will continue to offer stability and continuity for future generations, and will decide that one day the Prince of Wales should carry on the important work.
7 decades ago, Her Majesty left Westminster Abbey wearing the imperial crown and was escorted to Buckingham Palace in a parade of 30,000 soldiers, many from the former empire. But it was as head of a Commonwealth of independent nations that she reigned. She visited almost every one of its member states, many of them repeatedly, from Canada to New Zealand, from Ghana to the tiny Western Pacific atolls of Tuvalu. A Commonwealth shaped and supported by a deep affection and respect for the Queen.
James Landale reporting. Tributes have, of course, poured in from all over the world, as we can hear now from my colleagues Razia Iqbal and James Kumarasamy.
Among them, the US President Joe Biden, who has called the Queen a stateswoman of unmatched dignity and constancy. President Macron of France said Queen Elizabeth embodied the British nation's continuity and unity for over 70 years, and he remembered her as a friend of France and a kind-hearted queen. The Irish President, Michael D. Higgins, called the Queen a remarkable friend of Ireland, and he said her state visit to Ireland in 2011 marked a crucial step in the normalisation of relations with nearest neighbours. The Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, said he was pained by the loss, adding that the Queen had personified dignity and decency in public life. He also said that during one of his meetings with the Queen, she had shown him the handkerchief that Mahatma Gandhi had given her on her wedding. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said the Queen's wonderful humour would be missed, and the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said Queen Elizabeth was admired around the world for her grace, dignity and dedication.
And there has also been reaction from the Pope to His Majesty King Charles III. The Pope wrote he was deeply saddened to learn of the death of Her Majesty, offering heartfelt condolences to Your Majesty, the King, of course, the members of the royal family, the people of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. He said, I willingly join all who mourn her loss in praying for the late Queen's eternal rest and in paying tribute to her life of unstinting service to the good of the nation and the Commonwealth, her example of devotion to duty, her steadfast witness of faith in Jesus Christ and her firm hope in his promises. There has also been an emotional statement from the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He paid this tribute to the Queen.
She was one of my favourite people in the world, and I will miss her so. It is with the deepest of sorrow that we learn today of the passing of Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. She was our Queen for almost half of Canada's existence, and she had an obvious, deep, and abiding love and affection for Canadians. I'm having trouble believing that my last sit-down with her was my last. I will so miss those chats. She was thoughtful, wise, curious, helpful, funny, and so much more. In a complicated world, her steady grace and resolve brought comfort and strength to us all.
Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Queen Elizabeth derived enormous pleasure from the sport of horse racing. She owned and bred horses throughout her reign, earning considerable respect for her knowledge of bloodstock and training. And nothing was more fun for her, it seemed, than a day at the races. Our sports editor Dan Rowan looks back on the Queen's involvement in the sport.
Top trip as they run towards the final furlong. Simon and
Estimate hits the front in the 2013 Gold Cup at Ascot.
Estimate has a neck in hand of Simon, a royal win in the Gold Cup.
And a moment of sheer joy for the owner, Her Majesty the Queen.
Look at the delight there.
A victory that saw her become the first reigning monarch to win the trophy in the 207-year history of one of the sport's most prestigious races. Her Majesty had been due to present the trophy, but in the event found herself receiving it instead. For a monarch who relished the excitement of being at the races, this was an especially proud moment.
In the centre of the ring, the princess makes friends with the competitors' mounts.
The young Princess Elizabeth rode from an early age and inherited her parents' passion for racing. Her mother favoured national hunt racing, but like her father, Elizabeth preferred the flat.
I suppose I first became interested in racing during the war, when my father had leased Big Game and Sun Chariot from the National Stud. When my father took me down to Beckhampton to see them working, and I was able to pat them in the stable afterwards. I'd never felt the satiny softness of a thoroughbred before.
And Oriole is hanging on very well at the moment.
1954 saw her crowned champion flat owner in just her second season. Her horse, Oriole, came second in the Derby, then won the King George VI and Queen Elizabeth Diamond Stakes at Ascot.
Well, Oriole's always been an independent and frankly naughty. character. He was often loose at Newmarket when he was in training, which I think was why it didn't disturb him when he got loose at Ascot before he won the King George VI that year.
The successes kept coming. Dunfermline winning a historic double, the Oaks and the St Leger in 1977, Silver Jubilee year. Her knowledge of racehorses was formidable, even though from the 1980s she couldn't always compete with the oil wealth of Middle Eastern owners or the success of the Irish. As a breeder, she greatly improved the quality of British bloodstock through the Royal Studs at Sandringham. Though her famous colours recorded more than 1,800 victories both at home and abroad, the Queen failed in her greatest ambition. The Derby, alone out of the English classics, was to elude her. The only win she could muster at Epsom was in the sweepstake. On her mother's death, she inherited a string of jump horses, visiting the Cheltenham Festival in 2009 for the very first time to watch her horse Barber's Shop finish 7th in the Gold Cup. Having first attended Royal Ascot more than 70 years ago, she did so once again in June. 2021 proving Her Majesty's most successful ever horse racing year. And the sport will always remember her tireless and lifelong commitment as owner, breeder and enthusiast.
Our sports editor Dan Rowan reporting. This has been Global News, marking the death of Queen Elizabeth II. In the coming days, we'll hear much more about her legacy and what happens next for King Charles III. If you'd like to comment on this podcast, do drop us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk, or you'll find us on Twitter @GlobalNewsPod. This edition was mixed by Nick Randell. The producers were Madeline Drury, Ed Horton and Nisha Patel. The editor is Karen Martin. My name's Andrew Peach. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.